The last time all 12 of them were in the same room, Jesus was washing their feet. A few hours later, one of them would betray him. Another would deny knowing him 3 times, and the rest would scatter into the dark like men who'd never met him. That's where the story usually ends in most churches. Crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. And then, nothing. As if the apostles vanished into the margins of history the moment Jesus left the earth. But they didn't vanish. They went everywhere. From Jerusalem to India, from Rome to Ethiopia, from the shores of the Black Sea to the deserts of Persia. 12 ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, political radicals, fanned out across the ancient world and planted a faith so deep that empires couldn't uproot it. And almost every one of them died for it. Not peacefully, not quietly. Yet they were crucified, beheaded, stabbed, stoned, skinned alive, and sawn in half. And here's the detail that should stop you. Not one of them recanted. Not one of them, under torture, under threat of death, said, "We made it up. He didn't rise. It was a lie." People will die for something they believe is true. People don't die for something they know is false. And these men were in a position to know. They were there. They either saw the resurrected Jesus, or they didn't. And every single one of them went to their grave insisting they did. This is the story of what happened after the Gospels ended. The chapter they don't teach in Sunday school. And it's the most compelling evidence for the resurrection that most Christians have never heard. Let's start with the one we know the most about, and because his story after the resurrection is one of the most dramatic reversals in human history. Peter, Simon Peter, the fisherman from Galilee who couldn't stop putting his foot in his mouth, the man who sank in the water because his faith wavered, the man who pulled out a sword in the garden and then Ramainwa, the man who denied Jesus 3 times by a fire before the rooster crowed. That man became the leader of the early church. After Pentecost, the day the Holy Spirit descended on the disciples, and Peter stood up and preached to thousands in Jerusalem, Peter became the most visible and vocal leader of the Christian movement. He performed healings. He was arrested and miraculously freed from prison. He opened the door of the faith to Gentiles when he visited the Roman centurion Cornelius. He became, as Jesus had predicted, the rock on which the church would be built. But his story doesn't end in Jerusalem. According to multiple early church sources, Clement of Rome, writing around 96 AD, Tertullian in the 2nd century, and the church historian Eusebius in the 4th century, Peter eventually made his way to Rome, the capital of the empire, the seat of power of the very civilization that had crucified his teacher. And there, during the reign of Emperor Nero, sometime around 64 to 68 AD, Peter was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death by crucifixion. According to tradition, recorded by Origen and others, Peter requested to be crucified upside down because he didn't consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Think about that for a moment. The man who once denied knowing Jesus, who sat by a fire and swore to a servant girl, "I don't know him," chose to die on a cross rather than deny him again. Upside down, in the capital of the most powerful empire on earth. Something happened to Peter between the courtyard and the cross. Something that turned a coward into a man who would hang inverted on a Roman execution device rather than take back a single word. Archaeologists have excavated beneath St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City and found a burial site that dates to the 1st century. Whether the bones found there belonged to Peter is debated. but the tradition placing his death in Rome is among the strongest and most widely attested in early Christian history. James, the son of Zebedee, one of the inner circle, along with Peter and John, the three disciples closest to Jesus. He was with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, but he was with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He and his brother John were nicknamed Sons of Thunder, which tells you something about their personalities. James has the distinction of being the only apostle whose death is recorded in the New Testament itself. Acts 12:1-2 says it plainly. King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. Put to death with the sword. That almost certainly means beheaded. Around 44 AD, roughly 14 years after the crucifixion, James became the first of the 12 to be martyred. The king who ordered it was Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great. He killed James to win political favor with the Jewish religious establishment. It worked so well that he immediately arrested Peter too, while intending to execute him after the Passover festival. Peter escaped, miraculously, according to Acts. But James was gone. An early tradition, recorded by Clement of Alexandria, adds a detail that most people never hear. Clement wrote that the soldier who guarded James was so moved by his testimony at his trial that the guard converted on the spot. The soldier declared himself a Christian and was sentenced to die alongside James. As they were being led to execution together, the guard asked James to forgive him. James looked at him, said, "Peace be to you," and kissed him. Then they were both beheaded. Whether that story is historically verifiable is another matter, but it was circulating among Christians within a century and a half of the event. And it tells you something about the impression James left on the people around him. James, the beloved disciple, the one who leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, the one who stood at the foot of the cross, the only male disciple who didn't run, the one to whom Jesus entrusted the care of his mother Mary. John is the only one of the 12 who is traditionally believed to have died of natural causes. He lived the longest, possibly into his 90s, and spent his later years in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, where he wrote the Gospel of John, 3 epistles, and, according to tradition, the Book of Revelation during his exile on the island of Patmos. But natural causes doesn't mean he lived a peaceful life. Far from it. John was reportedly arrested and brought to Rome during the reign of Emperor Domitian, where, according to Tertullian, he was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil and emerged unharmed. Whether that event is historical or legendary, John was subsequently exiled to the penal colony on Patmos, where he received the visions recorded in Revelation. He was eventually released and returned to Ephesus, where he lived out his remaining years as the elder statesman of the early church. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, knew Polycarp, who had been a direct student of John. That chain, John to Polycarp to Irenaeus, is one of the most important links in the transmission of early Christian tradition. John watched his brother James be beheaded. He watched Peter be led away to crucifixion. He outlived every other apostle, and he kept teaching, kept writing, kept bearing witness, for decades, to a risen Christ he had seen with his own eyes and touched with his own hands. Andrew, Peter's brother, and the first disciple Jesus called, the one who brought Peter to Jesus in the first place. After the events of Acts, Andrew disappears from the biblical record. But early traditions place him traveling north and east to Scythia, which is roughly modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, and to Greece. The early church historian Eusebius records that Andrew's territory of ministry was the region around the Black Sea. According to tradition, Andrew was crucified in the Greek city of Patras around 60 AD. The form of his cross became distinctive, an X-shaped cross, which has been known ever since as the St. Andrew's Cross. It appears on the flag of Scotland to this day, because Scottish tradition claims Andrew as its patron saint. The reason for the X-shaped cross, according to the tradition, is the same reason Peter chose to be crucified upside down. Andrew didn't feel worthy to die on the same shape of cross as Jesus. But unlike a standard crucifixion, Andrew was reportedly tied to the cross rather than nailed, which prolonged his suffering. According to early accounts, he hung on that cross for 2 days, preaching to everyone who passed by, before he finally died. 2 days, tied to a cross, preaching. Thomas, the one everyone calls Doubting Thomas, a nickname that does him a spectacular injustice, because what Thomas did after his doubt was resolved is one of the most extraordinary missionary journeys in ancient history. After demanding to see and touch the wounds of the risen Jesus and receiving exactly that, Thomas became one of the most fearless evangelists among the 12. And tradition places him traveling farther than any other apostle, east through Mesopotamia, through Persia, and all the way to India. This isn't legend without foundation. In the coastal city of Chennai in southern India, there exists a Christian community, the St. Thomas Christians, also known as the Nazrani, that traces its origins directly to Thomas. This community has existed for roughly 2,000 years. They have their own liturgical traditions, their own history, and their own claim that Thomas arrived on their shores around 52 AD and established churches along the Malabar coast. According to Indian Christian tradition, Thomas was killed around 72 AD near the city of Mylapore, just outside modern Chennai. He was stabbed with a spear while praying at a site that is now marked by San Thome Basilica, at one of the oldest churches in India. The man who doubted the resurrection traveled farther than any other apostle to proclaim it. He crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans. He left behind the entire Mediterranean world and walked into a civilization that had never heard the name of Jesus. And he died on his knees, praying, with a spear in his body. That's not the story of a man who had lingering doubts. Philip. Not to be confused with Philip the Evangelist from the Book of Acts. This is Philip the Apostle, one of the original 12, from the town of Bethsaida. Traditions about Philip's missionary work place him in Greece and in Phrygia, a region of Asia Minor in modern-day Turkey. Polycrates, the 2nd century bishop of Ephesus, wrote that Philip was buried at Hierapolis, and in 2011, the Italian archaeologists announced they had discovered what they believed to be Philip's tomb at the ancient site. The manner of Philip's death varies depending on the source. Some traditions say he was crucified. Others say he was crucified upside down, following Peter's example. Some say he was hanged. What the traditions agree on is that he was killed for his faith in the ancient city of Hierapolis, and that his death was connected to a confrontation with pagan worship. Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael, the disciple who initially asked, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" and then, upon meeting Jesus, declared him the Son of God and the King of Israel. Traditions send Bartholomew on one of the widest-ranging missionary journeys of any apostle. Some accounts place him in India, alongside Thomas. Others place him in Armenia, and where he is credited with establishing one of the oldest national churches in the world. Armenia officially adopted Christianity as its state religion in 301 AD, decades before the Roman Empire did, and Bartholomew and Thaddius are honored as the founders of the Armenian Church. The tradition regarding Bartholomew's death is among the most gruesome of all the apostles. He is said to have been flayed alive, his skin removed while he was still living, and then beheaded or crucified. This tradition is the reason that in classical Christian art, Bartholomew is often depicted holding his own skin. Michelangelo included this image in his Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, and painted his own face on the flayed skin as an act of humility. Matthew, the former tax collector. You're the man who sat at a booth collecting revenue for the Roman occupation and was despised by his own people for it. Jesus walked up to his booth and said 2 words, "Follow me." And Matthew left everything behind. Matthew is credited with writing the gospel that bears his name, the first book of the New Testament, written to a Jewish audience to demonstrate that Jesus was the promised Messiah. After the events recorded in Acts, traditions place Matthew's missionary work in Ethiopia, Persia, and Parthia. The accounts of his death vary. Some sources say he was killed by a sword in Ethiopia. Others say he died naturally. The earliest traditions are unclear, which is why scholars list his death as uncertain in terms of method. But what is clear is that Matthew, a man who had built his career collaborating with the occupying empire, spent the rest of his life traveling through hostile territory to proclaim a kingdom that had nothing to do with Rome's power and everything to do with a Jewish carpenter who had risen from the dead. James, the son of Alphaeus, sometimes called James the Less or James the Younger, to distinguish him from James, the son of Zebedee. This James is one of the most obscure of the 12. He's mentioned in the lists of apostles, but the Bible records almost nothing about his individual actions or words. Tradition places his ministry in Syria and Egypt. According to some early sources, including a text attributed to Hippolytus, James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, then Talmud, and finally struck on the head with a fuller's club. There is considerable confusion among scholars and traditions between James the son of Alphaeus and James the brother of Jesus, who led the church in Jerusalem and whose death is recorded by the Jewish historian Josephus. Josephus writes that this James was brought before the Sanhedrin and condemned to death by stoning around 62 AD. Whether the apostle and the brother of Jesus are the same person has been debated for centuries. Thaddius, also known as Judas, son of James, not Judas Iscariot. He's sometimes referred to as Lebbaeus. He appears in the apostle lists and asks one question in the entire gospel record. At the Last Supper, in John 14:22, he asks Jesus, "Lord, how is it that you will reveal yourself to us and not to the world?" To answer that question, how will you show yourself to us and not to everyone else, might be the most relatable question any apostle ever asked. And Jesus' answer was essentially, by coming to live inside those who love me. Tradition places Thaddeus' ministry in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Persia. He is said to have been martyred alongside Simon the Zealot in Persia, killed by pagan priests who opposed their preaching. The accounts vary on the method. Some say he was clubbed to death, others say he was crucified. Simon the Zealot. Before he followed Jesus, Simon was a member of the Zealots, a political faction devoted to the violent overthrow of Roman rule. He was, in modern terms, a revolutionary, a resistance fighter. But Jesus took a man who believed in violent political revolution and made him a disciple of a kingdom that conquered through love, sacrifice, and forgiveness. The fact that Simon and Matthew, a zealot who hated Rome and a tax collector who worked for Rome, were both part of the same group of 12 is one of the most quietly radical details in the entire New Testament. Traditions about Simon's fate vary widely. The most common Western tradition says he was sawn in half in Persia, martyred alongside Thaddius. Other traditions place his death in Armenia or even in Britain. The details are uncertain. What is not uncertain is that he died for the same message as the rest. A dead man rose, and the world would never be the same. Matthias, the one chosen by Lot to replace Judas Iscariot, as recorded in Acts 1. We know almost nothing about him from Scripture. Traditions about his missionary work send him to Ethiopia, the Caucasus region, or back to Jerusalem. Accounts of his death say he was stoned and then beheaded, or possibly crucified. The details are the least reliable of any apostle. But what we know for certain is this: he was there from the beginning. Acts 1:21-22 says the criteria for replacing Judas was that the candidate had to have been with Jesus from the baptism of John all the way through the ascension. Matthias met that requirement. He was a witness to everything, and he was willing to step into a role that came with a near-certain death sentence. And then there's Paul, not one of the original 12, but arguably the most influential apostle of all. The man who persecuted the church and then became its greatest missionary. The man who wrote 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. The man who planted churches across the Roman Empire and shaped Christian theology more than any other single individual. Paul was beheaded in Rome during Nero's persecution, around 64 to 67 AD. As a Roman citizen, he was entitled to execution by the sword rather than crucifixion, a quicker, less humiliating death than what Peter endured. But before the sword fell, Paul had been beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, imprisoned, and left for dead more times than he could count. He catalogs his suffering in 2 Corinthians 11 with a frankness that borders on dark humor. 5 times I received 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. The man who wrote about the peace that surpasses all understanding wrote it from a prison cell. The man who wrote about joy wrote it in chains. The man who declared that nothing can separate us from the love of God said it knowing that a Roman sword was waiting for his neck. Now step back and look at the full picture. 12 men, ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, political radicals, nobodies from a backwater province of the Roman Empire. They had no armies, no political connections, no wealth, no institutional backing. And within a single generation, they had carried the message of a crucified and risen carpenter from Nazareth to India, Ethiopia, Persia, Greece, Rome, Armenia, Turkey, Egypt, and the shores of the Black Sea. Almost every one of them died for it, crucified, beheaded, speared, stoned, flayed, sawn apart. And not one of them, not a single one, under torture, under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, said it wasn't true. Now you can debate the historicity of individual traditions. You can argue about which details are reliable and which are legendary embellishments added centuries later. Fair enough. Not every tradition about the apostles carries the same historical weight. But the broad pattern is undeniable. Multiple independent streams of tradition, from different centuries, different regions, different cultures, all agree on the same basic picture. The apostles scattered, preached, suffered, and died. They didn't get rich. They didn't build empires. They didn't live comfortable lives. They died telling the same story they'd been telling since the morning they found an empty tomb. And maybe that's the detail that matters most. Not the specific method of each death, but the fact that these men had every reason to recant, and not one of them did. They knew. They were there. They had seen something with their own eyes that changed them from a group of terrified men hiding in a locked room into a force that reshaped the entire world. Something happened in that first century. Something that turned cowards into martyrs. Something that sent fishermen to the ends of the earth with a message they could have easily abandoned, but never did. Whatever that something was, the apostles took it to their graves. Every single one. And 2,000 years later, their names are the most common names in the Western world. Peter, John, James, Andrew, Thomas, Matthew, Philip, Paul. You probably know a dozen people with those names. Now you might carry one yourself. 12 ordinary men who refused to stop talking about what they saw, even when it killed them. And the world still hasn't stopped listening. If this changed how you see the early church, the story of how Christianity conquered the Roman Empire, without an army, without a government, without a single advantage except a message, is even more staggering. I tell the whole thing in my next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it.